Welcome back. All right, I want to talk about Chicago. Yes, I want to talk about Chicago because I want to talk about Chicago. So I talked about the San Jose Sharks not too long back there about how San Jose was likely to be the worst team in the league. Chicago's going to be down there too, though. And Chicago has a lot of good young players. They also have some veterans, and that's the key. Getting through this rebuild, which they have finally admitted, right? Last year they admitted it. This is a team that's made the playoffs once since 2017, and that was in 2020. A playoff appearance which was predicated on the expanded 2020 playoffs and them winning a play-in round against the Oilers. Shocking upset there. And then bowing out in what was the first round against the Vegas Golden Knights. So for Chicago, one thing to keep an eye on is, while their roster is not fantastic, they have a lot of cap space. So $12,864,876. Chicago are going to be a player, and they may very well make a move before the season starts because there are teams who need to get under the cap before the season starts, and I would imagine they'll call Chicago and say, look, what do we have to do? Chicago will probably answer with, what kind of prospects and draft picks are you willing to part with, along with this asset that will get you under the cap? This is a team that has 2 firsts and 3 second-round draft picks in 2024. They have 2 firsts and 2 seconds in 2025, 1 first and 3 seconds in 2026. The stockpiling of draft picks has really and truly begun, and it's not over. The one thing about this is, and I've talked about this a lot over the years, is the teardown tends to be the easier part of the job. Not like super easy, but renting guys out and deciding to let contracts expire and picking up those prospects draft picks, you can do that. And then it's a matter of how you build it up again. Keeping in mind the last rebuild of this team went from 2002, 2003 to 2007, 2008. But it also followed a period of just general mediocrity by the Blackhawks, where they were trying to make the right additions and draft picks to quickly get above that playoff line, and they just couldn't do it. And there was some bad draft picks in the late 90s. There were some bad moves around that time by Chicago. It was not as well run an organization as it would be later. And so they win 3 Stanley Cups, and now we're into the rebuild that you get into after you've been good for a long time. Now, of course, Connor Bedard is your headliner. And the most important thing to Chicago this year is Connor Bedard. He has to produce. He has to be comfortable. They have to make sure that he is progressing at the pace they want him to. And they also have to keep it so that not all the pressure is necessarily on him. Now, 25 and under players on this roster. Philip Kurashev, solid third liner on most teams, may end up first, second liner here. Lucas Reichel, there's some excitement about Reichel. Not as much as Bedard, obviously, but there's some excitement with Reichel, what he brings. Cole Gutman, hardworking, bottom six forward. Taylor Radish, picked up from Tampa Bay a year and a half back. And Radish, capable of providing them with 20, 25 goals in a season. On the blue line, you've got Kevin Korchinski, likely to make this team. He may end up being the Keith on this team to Bedard's Patrick Kane, right? So if you're looking for who they might be replacing, it might be Kane and Keith that Korchinski and Bedard are compared to years from now, right? Alex Vlasic is also under the age of 25 and is on the board. In the net, Arvid Soderblom may very well get the net. Jackson Stauber may end up being the backup. It doesn't really matter. This is not a season where Chicago is going to be expecting a lot of wins, and so I wouldn't be surprised if they employ 3, 4, 5 different goaltenders this year, because it could be a long season. And one thing that you want to make sure of is that, young players aren't just humiliated out there, that there's at least some good moments. Like, it's going to be a rough year, but you want to make sure that progression's there and that it's not a completely miserable experience. Now, other guys who may very well make the lineup: Boris Kachuk, picked up from Tampa as well. Reese Johnson, Mackenzie Entwistle. I've got Colton Dach on the board because why not? I figured throw somebody else who's young on the board. Very, very unlikely to make the roster necessarily, but sure, I figured I'd throw him up there. On the blue line, you've got Philip Roos, you've got Isaac Phillips, you've got Wyatt Kaiser, all appeared in games for them last season, and Drew Commesso is obviously going to be the guy. He is going to be the goaltender on this team soon, and so it's all a matter of everybody gelling and it working. One thing about picking up draft picks and prospects is some of them are going to bust. So you almost need like a redundancy in place. You need to have, this is why Arizona has got as many prospects as they do. Go get as many draft picks as you can, because if one or two of them bust, you're still okay because you have so many top prospects in your system. So looking at the veterans, the guys who are going to kind of shepherd this team along. Tyler Johnson, 33 years of age. And if you're like, oh, right, Tyler Johnson's still playing. Yeah. Very, very quiet existence in Chicago at this stage. He played 56 games last year, 12 goals, 20 assists, 32 points. Johnson's still a solid veteran. I would not be surprised to see him moved around deadline time. He's got a lot of experience, and if he can be healthy around deadline time, sure. Because this team's going to be running guys out. Taylor Hall, 31 years of age, 61 games with Boston, 16 goals, 20 assists, 36 points. Not as dangerous offensively as he was, say, 5 years ago, especially not from 10 years ago, but Hall is still capable of producing, and as a former number one draft pick himself, he is a good guy to have there for Bedard. Nick Foligno, 35 years of age, 60 games, 10 goals, 16 assists, 26 points with Boston last year. Foligno had a nice bounce back year from the year before. And again, Foligno, Hall, Johnson all understanding their roles, as does Corey Perry, 38 years of age, signing here, 81 games, 12 goals, 13 assists, 25 points. So one thing to keep in mind is that the cap hits with some of these veterans, despite the cap space that Chicago has, it's going to make them a little bit harder to move at the deadline. A lot of teams up against the cap, and so if they decide to rent a couple of guys out at the deadline, it may make it a little more difficult with the cap hits they've got. But they're not worried about that right now, are they? They're worried about making sure they've got these guys here, that they're comfortable, and that they're providing the right amount of leadership for this team. A team that won't have a captain this year, which makes some sense. When Jonathan Toews leaves, that's a large shadow being cast over that locker room. I wouldn't want to be a captain on that team this year either. Connor Murphy on the blue line, 30 years of age, 80 games last year, 7 goals, 6 assists, 13 points. Jared Tenorti, 31 years of age, only played 44 games last year, 2 goals, 6 assists, 8 points. And honestly, Tenorti plays well under Richardson, so keep an eye on him early in the season. If he can avoid an injury, I think he can have a good year. Nikita Zaitsev, also 31 years of age, 46 games, 1 goal, 7 assists, 8 points. And he's there because of that contract, right? So Chicago able to pay the contract, and they have a spot in their lineup for him, so sure, why not pick up Zaitsev? And of course, Peter Mrazek in the net. The one thing to keep in mind with Mrazek, he does get hurt. Almost any season you watch, he's going to get injured for a while. Will Chicago go with Soderblom and Stauber as their goaltenders during an injury for Mrazek? Maybe, but I wouldn't be surprised if Chicago went out and got a backup that they know they can employ for 10 to 15 games. And I mean, either using the waiver wire to do so or picking somebody up in the event that Mrazek got hurt. So making phone calls if Mrazek got hurt. One thing for Chicago this year, there's no pressure on them to make the playoffs. There's no real expectation this team's going to get a lot better. They may just be better for the fact that, you know, they've got Bedard, there's that excitement, and there are some good veterans on this team. They may surprise some people. Also, they're going to get taken for granted quite a bit. Opponents of the Chicago Blackhawks may take them lightly, and very often in the NHL, even if it is a bottom-feeding team that's only got 15 wins, if you take them lightly and that team knows you're taking them lightly, they may not like it very much. And of course, there are a couple of other big names out there yet to sign in terms of their prospects. Frank Nazar and Oliver Moore. And Oliver Moore turned some heads for them at their rookie camp. May end up being an absolute steal in this draft for them. So while everybody looks at Bedard and goes, I can't believe Chicago got Bedard, and that's just, they shouldn't be able to draft first overall. Well, here's the thing. Chicago could win a draft lottery next year and end up in a top 2 spot. Now, Celebrini is the likeliest one to go first overall next year. He does not have the same amount of hype as Bedard, and he's not going to. Very, very few do. But as much as we're going to talk about, you know, their draft lottery likelihood as the season goes along, I think Oliver Moore was a steal for them. When you look at some of the draft lists before that draft happened, Oliver Moore was seen as a solid top 10 pick at points during the season and by certain scouts. So Chicago getting him when they did, that may end up being an absolute steal. He doesn't sign a contract. He doesn't need to. he could sign with them next summer. So there's good pieces to this team. There's good parts to this team. The one question I have is, at what point in time, it's not going to be this season, but at what point in time do you say, all right, does Kyle Davidson say, okay, all right, it's time, we're going to build up and try to get to the playoffs? Because as we've seen with Detroit and Ottawa, especially in the East, it can be tough. It can be really tough to get above the playoff line. You've got 16 out of 32 teams missing the playoffs. To get to the playoffs, you've got to be better than half the league, which wasn't always the case in the NHL. I'm old enough to remember when 16 out of 21 made it. So instead of looking at it as, well, this team's not going to make it, you'd say, well, gee, they only have to be better than 5 other teams in the league. Yeah, they could make it. So it's a completely different scenario now, which might be why teams do the full teardown and go for that rebuild. It has definitely been a pretty complete teardown of the Chicago Blackhawks. Kyle Davidson, I think, has done a good job with the assets he's had and how he's parlayed them. And I do think that Luke Richardson's a good coach who will probably get more wins for Chicago this year than he has any right to, much like Tourney in Arizona. And so we'll see how it all ends up going. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. How bad are Chicago going to be this year? What do you expect? And do you expect, like, Taylor Hall's numbers to get better if he's playing with Bedard? Does that bring him back up to around a point per game? Do we see a similar effect to, like, Pavelski playing with Hintz and Robertson and Pavelski? And I think that's a mutually beneficial relationship in Dallas. Could we see that with Hall and Bedard? And what does Athanasiou do if he ends up playing with Bedard? Athanasiou's got speed for days. He's also got some talent. Could he and Bedard have some chemistry as well? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. And the question, how many years does it take? How many years does it take for Chicago to end up being a good team? My guess is 3. My guess is 3. Looking at 2026, it might be 2026 before we're talking about them climbing up towards a playoff position. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.